The Iranian Plateau is a high, unforgiving fortress of salt and stone, a geological anomaly that has for 3 millennia dictated the destiny of those who dwell upon its heights. It is not merely a land defined by borders, but a crucible where the Iranian Idea, or Iran-shahr, was forged under the immense pressure of geography and time. To the early Achaemenids, this was more than a kingdom. It was a cosmic order, a sophisticated administrative machine that viewed the world through the lens of divine justice and bureaucratic precision. Driven by this conviction, the Persians did not just build roads, they built a nervous system for the ancient world, creating a state that functioned with a regularity that mirrored the stars. Consequently, when the iron-shod boots of foreign conquerors eventually breached the Zagros Mountains, they did not find a fragile or primitive state, but a civilizational gravity so dense it began to warp the trajectory of the victors. The myth of Iranian fragility, often peddled by those who view history through the narrow lens of military maps, ignores the reality of a cultural resilience that operates on a different timescale. War is a momentary rupture, but the Iranian idea is a permanent state of being, an intellectual framework that refused to vanish even when its kings were slain and its palaces burned. In 330 BCE, Alexander of Macedon stood amidst the smoking ruins of Persepolis, a conqueror who had ostensibly dismantled the greatest empire the world had ever known. The psychological state of the Macedonian army was one of triumphalist exhaustion, yet in the quiet aftermath of the fires, a profound shift occurred within the young king. He did not impose Greek law upon the Persians. Instead, he began to wear the Median robe and demanded the prostration of his generals, much to their Hellenic disgust. This was not a surrender to vanity, but a calculated recognition of the necessity of the Iranian administrative framework. Driven by the sheer scale of the territory he now held, Alexander realized that to rule Iran, he had to become Iranian. He orchestrated the mass weddings at Susa, where 10,000 of his soldiers were commanded to take Persian wives in an attempt to fuse two worlds into one. Had Alexander lived another decade, the capital of his world would likely have been Susa or Babylon, not Pella, and the Hellenic world would have been absorbed into the Persian whole. This "what if" hangs over the ruins of the palace like a ghost, a testament to how close the conqueror came to being the conquered by the very systems he sought to replace. Centuries later, the exhaustion of the Sassanid-Byzantine wars created a vacuum into which the Arab armies poured. In the 7th century, the collective spirit of the era was one of apocalyptic expectation and radical change, as the old world orders crumbled under the weight of their own antiquity. The Sassanid state collapsed after the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, its armies broken and its king of kings a fugitive in his own land. Yet, the machinery of the state remained intact beneath the surface. Driven by the pragmatic need to govern vast new territories that the desert-dwelling conquerors could not yet comprehend, the Umayyad and later Abbasid caliphates found themselves utterly dependent on the Persian Deccans, the landed gentry and administrators. Evidence of this survival is found in the administrative records of the early caliphate, which remained written in Persian for decades after the conquest. A single, unnamed scribe, perhaps sitting in a dim room in Basra or Kufa, spent his life translating the complex tax codes and agricultural wisdom of Sassanid kings into Arabic. Through his ink, the administrative soul of Iran entered the veins of the Arab world. The divan, the very concept of a structured government department, was a Persian transplant into the body of an Arab empire, ensuring that while the faith changed, the manner of rule remained quintessentially Iranian. This cultural persistence was not merely a matter of paperwork, it was a linguistic struggle for the soul of the people. Following the Arab conquest, the Persian language faced an existential threat. Yet it survived by a deliberate and intellectual counteroffensive known as the Shubuwiyya movement.
This was a time when the Persian elite asserted their cultural superiority through literature and ancestry, refusing to let their identity be subsumed by the new religious order. The forensic proof of this survival is the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, composed by the poet Ferdowsi over 30 years. He wrote in a new Persian that intentionally avoided Arabic loanwords, creating a linguistic shield that protected the Iranian identity from total assimilation. Consequently, the Persian language did not die like the languages of Egypt or Mesopotamia. It evolved, becoming the lingua franca of high culture from the Balkans to the borders of China. The Iranian idea had proved that it could survive the loss of sovereignty by making itself indispensable to the intellectual and spiritual life of its new masters. The most brutal test of this resilience arrived in the 13th century. The Mongol invasion was not a war in the traditional sense, it was a tectonic shift. The hoofbeats of the Mongol Tumans were not a sound, but a vibration in the earth, signaling a destruction so total it defied logic. In 1258, the smoke from the burning libraries of Baghdad signaled the end of an era, and the irrigation systems of the Iranian Plateau, built over a millennium, were systematically destroyed. Yet, within a generation, the fierce Ilkhanid Mongols were no longer living in tents, but in palaces designed by Persian architects and decorated with the intricate patterns of the plateau. They were no longer slaughtering populations, but funding the Moraga Observatory under the guidance of the polymath Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. A weather report from a specific Tuesday in the late 19th century might have noted the bitter cold of the plateau that broke the Mongol horses, but the real breaking of the Mongols was done by the Persian courtier. The sword of the nomad had been blunted by the silk of the courtier and the logic of the bureaucrat. The Mongol rulers eventually adopted the very language and customs of the people they had tried to annihilate, becoming the greatest patrons of Persian art and literature. This pattern of cultural recursion defines the Iranian experience and continues to shape the modern world. The borders of the modern state still trace the outlines of that ancient plateau, and the Iranian idea remains a quiet, pervasive force in the regional psyche. The legacy of this resilience is seen not in monuments of stone, which are fragile and prone to ruin, but in the enduring continuity of a mindset that refuses to be erased. The empire that conquered its conquerors did so by understanding a fundamental truth of history. While power can be seized by force, it can only be sustained through the sophisticated systems of the mind. Today, the echoes of the Sassanid court and the verses of Ferdowsi still resonate in the halls of power and the streets of Tehran, a reminder that the Iranian plateau is less a territory and more a state of mind that has outlasted every army that ever dared to cross its borders. The Iranian idea remains an immovable object in the path of history, a cultural gravity that continues to reshape everyone it touches.
The dust that settled over the ruins of Nineveh in 612 BCE did more than mark the end of the Assyrian Empire. It signaled the exhaustion of a world order defined by the aesthetics of terror. For centuries, the psychological state of the Near East had been one of punctuated trauma, a collective resignation to the reality that power was a zero-sum game played with the currency of flaying and deportation. When Cyrus II, later called the Great, emerged from the rugged highlands of Persis, he did not merely inherit this vacuum, he recognized that the old mechanics of fear were no longer sustainable for a state that intended to endure beyond the lifespan of its conqueror. Driven by this realization, the Achaemenid rise was characterized not by a desire to erase the identities of the conquered, but a revolutionary pragmatism that sought to co-opt them. In 539 BCE, as the gates of Babylon opened to his forces, the world witnessed the first implementation of governance as a contract rather than a siege. The forensic evidence of this shift remains etched into the baked clay of the Cyrus cylinder, a foundation deposit that serves as the world's first charter of human rights, though its intent was less idealistic and more brilliantly administrative. by decreeing that the gods of the various subject peoples be returned to their sanctuaries and that the displaced, including the Jewish exiles, be allowed to return to their homelands, Cyrus inverted the Assyrian model of forced homogenization. This was not a gesture of modern secularism, but a calculated effort to stabilize the periphery by making the imperial center the guarantor of local tradition. Historically, the fragility of this moment cannot be overstated. Had the Lydian king, Croesus, bolstered by the misinterpretation of an oracle, managed to repel the Persians at the Battle of Thymbra, the Western and Eastern relations might have been severed before its inception. It was a single tactical improvisation, Cyrus placing his baggage camels at the front of his line to spook the Lydian horses with their unfamiliar scent, that broke the finest cavalry in Asia and cleared the path for a Persian hegemony. Consequently, the Mediterranean was pulled into an Iranian orbit, creating a massive unified economic zone that had never before existed. As the empire expanded, the charismatic expansionism of Cyrus gave way to the institutional genius of Darius I, who understood that a kingdom won by the sword must be maintained by the ledger. The psychological state of the era transitioned from one of conquest to one of consolidation, where the spirit of the times was defined by an obsession with order and the classification of the known world. Darius transformed the empire into a sophisticated machine through the satrapy system, a precursor to modern federalism that divided the vast territory into 20 administrative provinces. Each satrap, or protector of the kingdom, held significant local authority, yet was checked by a system of royal inspectors known as the eyes and ears of the king. These inspectors were not mere spies, they were the human connective tissue of a bureaucracy that required constant calibration. To facilitate this, the Achaemenids engineered the Royal Road, a 1,600-mile artery stretching from Susa to Sardis. A letter written at dawn in the humid lowlands of Elam could reach the Aegean coast in less than a week, carried by a relay of couriers who operated with a discipline that would later inspire the postal services of the modern age. Within this overarching structure, the individual experience of history crystallized in the lives of those who maintained the machinery. Consider a nameless scribe in the treasury at Persepolis, his fingers stained with the damp clay of a fortification tablet. His world was not one of grand battles, but of meticulous accounting, recording the exact rations of barley and wine allocated to a team of female weavers from Ionia. This level of forensic detail reveals a society where labor was compensated and where the state took an active interest in the caloric intake of its workforce to ensure the efficiency of its grand architectural projects. This level of organization was only possible because of the stability provided by the Persian Pax, which allowed for the development of infrastructure that defied the limitations of the arid Iranian Plateau. The most significant of these was the Qanat system, a series of underground tunnels that tapped into distant aquifers to bring water to the parched heartland. This was a triumph of engineering excellence that required a deep understanding of geology and hydraulics, transforming the desert into a lush landscape of paradises, the walled gardens that became the physical manifestation of Achaemenid order and the etymological root of our own concept of heaven. The ethical backbone of this system was provided by Zoroastrianism, a faith that introduced a profound dualism into the global religious consciousness. The world was no longer seen as the playground of capricious deities, but a battlefield between the forces of light, led by Ahura Mazda, and the shadows of the lie, Angra Mainyu. This created a psychological imperative for the Persian citizen. To support the king was to support the truth, Arta. The great king was not a god himself as the pharaohs had been, but he was the divinely appointed maintainer of the cosmic balance. Inevitably, this religious framework influenced the nascent concepts of good and evil in the neighboring Jewish communities, filtering through them into the foundations of Christianity and Islam. The stability of the Achaemenid state thus provided the necessary context for the development of ethical systems that still govern the behavior of billions today. The fragility of this order was often tested by the sheer scale of its ambition. The Persian model relied on the delicate balance between central authority and local autonomy, a tension that was visible in the monumental architecture at Persepolis. Here, the stone reliefs do not depict the king treading on the necks of his enemies, but rather the representatives of all 23 nations of the empire, Medes, Elamites, Egyptians, and Indians, walking side by side, hand in hand, to bring their offerings. It was an image of voluntary participation in a global project, yet it was an image that could be shattered by the slightest tremor of central weakness. Had Darius not been able to suppress the widespread rebellions that followed the death of Cambyses II, the empire would have disintegrated into a dozen warring city-states, and the Silk Road, which found its earliest reliable safety under Persian protection, might never have matured into the primary bridge between East and West. This era of the Achaemenids established the fundamental character of the Iranian state as a middle ground, a cultural and economic clearinghouse where the ideas of the Indus Valley met the philosophy of the Mediterranean. The Khanats, some of which are still in use today after 2.5 millennia, serve as a silent testament to the endurance of Persian engineering and its ability to master a hostile environment. The administrative maps of the modern Middle East often trace the lines drawn by Achaemenid surveyors in the 5th century BCE. The architecture of order was not merely a conquest of land, but a conquest of chaos, creating a blueprint for the state that favored the pen over the spear and the road over the wall. As the sun set over the columns of the Apadana, the world was no longer a collection of isolated tribes, but a single interconnected entity bound by the logistics of the royal road and the ethical promise of a king who claimed to rule by the grace of the truth. The foundations laid by Cyrus and Darius ensured that even when the empire eventually fell to the Macedonian phalanx, the template for global governance had already been permanently etched into the consciousness of humanity.
The Persianate Synthesis. The year 651 did not merely signal the death of a king, but the apparent extinction of a 4-century-old order that had defined the horizon of the Near East. When Yazdegerd III, the last Sassanid monarch, was murdered by a nameless miller in Merv, the imperial project of Iran-shahr seemed destined to the same oblivion that had claimed the empires of the Bronze Age. The Arab Rashidun cavalry, driven by a desert-forged zeal and a tactical fluidity that the heavy Sassanid cataphracts could not match, had shattered the old world in a sequence of lightning campaigns. Yet, history is rarely a clean break. It is a process of inertia and absorption. The collapse of the Sassanid state was not the end of Persian civilization, but rather the beginning of its most expansive metamorphosis. As the dust of the conquest settled, the victors found themselves in possession of a complex, sprawling machine of statecraft that they were entirely unprepared to operate. The Arab tribesmen possessed a revolutionary theology and a formidable martial tradition, but they lacked the tedious, essential tools of empire: tax codes, irrigation schedules, and the intricate protocols of a sedentary bureaucracy. Inevitably, the sword made way for the reed pen, and the conquerors became the clients of the conquered. Driven by this administrative vacuum, the early caliphate was forced to rely on the surviving Persian landed gentry, the decans, who remained the vital connective tissue of the Iranian Plateau. These local lords, seeing the collapse of the central monarchy, did not vanish, they adapted. Consequently, the transition of power was characterized by a quiet, forensic continuity. A single tax collector in Rai, clutching a damp parchment of land deeds written in the complex Pahlavi script, represented more stability than 1,000 occupation troops. He was the guardian of the harvest cycles and the arbiter of the water rights that kept the desert from reclaiming the orchards.
The collective psychological state of this era was one of profound duality, a mourning for the lost Sassanid glory, coupled with a pragmatic realization that the new Islamic framework offered a path to preservation. The Decans learned the prayers of the new faith while keeping the ledgers of the old empire, ensuring that the underlying administrative DNA of Iran remained intact even as the ruling elite changed. The center of gravity shifted decisively in 750 with the Abbasid Revolution, a political earthquake that was as much a Persian restoration as it was an Islamic succession. The Umayyad Caliphate, centered in Damascus, had attempted to maintain an Arab-centric hierarchy, but the sheer weight of Persian numbers and intellectual sophistication made such a structure unsustainable. When the Abbasid banners rose in Khorasan, they were carried by Persian soldiers and funded by Persian merchants. The subsequent move of the capital from Syria to the newly built city of Baghdad, situated only miles from the ruins of the Sassanid capital of Ctesiphon, was a symbolic homecoming. Baghdad was not an Arab desert outpost. It was a circular metropolis designed along Sassanid cosmological lines. In this new capital, the Barmakid family, a dynasty of viziers of Buddhist-turned-Zoroastrian origin, became the true architects of the state. They transformed the caliphate into a Persianate monarchy in all but name, introducing the elaborate court etiquette, the hierarchical ministries, and the culture of patronage that would define the Islamic Golden Age. Consider for a moment a junior clerk in the Diwan of Harun al-Rashid, his fingers stained with the indigo ink of a new era. He spends his morning translating Sassanid military manuals into Arabic and his afternoon drafting a decree on the maintenance of the Tigris levees. He is the human face of this synthesis, a man who navigates two worlds with every stroke of his pen. If this anonymous scribe and his thousands of colleagues had failed to bridge the linguistic and structural gap between the old and the new, the caliphate likely would have fractured into a collection of warring tribal fiefdoms, and the intellectual treasures of the ancient world would have been lost to the fires of the transition. The fragility of this moment cannot be understated. The survival of Greek philosophy, Persian medicine, and Indian mathematics depended entirely on this specific, precarious administrative continuity. The psychological resistance to total Arabization manifested in the Shubaiyya movement, an intellectual insurgency that sought to assert the cultural superiority of the Persians within the Islamic community. This was not a rebellion of the sword, but of the library. Persian scholars argued that while the Arabs had brought the final revelation, it was the Persians who possessed the civilizational expertise to govern and enlighten the world. This tension gave rise to a flourishing of literature and science that was unprecedented. Polymaths like Al-Khwarizmi and Ibn Sina were the products of this synthesis. Individuals who thought in the logical structures of the Persian tradition, but expressed their findings in the universalizing language of Arabic. The spirit of the times was one of dizzying intellectual ambition, where the boundaries between faiths and ethnicities were blurred by a shared commitment to the house of wisdom. Had the Abbasid Caliphate remained a purely Arab enterprise, or had the Persian elite retreated into a defensive isolationism, the history of the world would have been fundamentally altered. The what-if of a failed synthesis suggests a Middle East that looked more like the fragmented landscapes of post-Roman Europe, insular, illiterate, and culturally stagnant. Instead, the Persianate choice to engage with the new theological framework created a vehicle for civilizational export. By the 9th century, the new Persian language emerged, written in Arabic script but retaining the soul of the Iranian tongue. This linguistic reclamation was solidified by Ferdowsi, who spent 30 years composing the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings. By intentionally omitting Arabic loanwords where possible, Ferdowsi didn't just write a poem, he resurrected a national identity. he proved that a people could change their religion without losing their ancestors. The legacy of this synthesis is the foundation of the modern Islamic world. The administrative structures, the poetic meters, and the architectural motifs birthed in this era eventually traveled along the Silk Road to the courts of the Mughals in India and the Ottomans in Anatolia. The Persianate world became a cultural commonality that transcended political borders, creating a shared intellectual space that stretched from the Balkans to the Bay of Bengal. Even today, the cadence of a Persian ghazal or the geometry of a blue-tiled dome in Isfahan serves as a silent testament to that 7th century crisis. What appeared to be a moment of total defeat for Iran, in reality, was the beginning of its greatest conquest, the conquest of the mind of its conquerors. The Sassanid crown was broken, but the Persian spirit simply found a larger room to dwell in.
The silence that followed the retreat of the Mongol Khans was not the peace of stability, but the hollowed-out exhaustion of a civilization. On the Iranian Plateau, the 14th and 15th centuries existed as a landscape of ruins, where the irrigation systems of the Khwarezmian era lay choked with silt, and the libraries of Nishapur were merely ash under the hooves of Timurid cavalry. This vacuum of central authority created a psychological dislocation. The collective spirit of the Persian world had been fractured, leaving a population searching for a unifying principle that could withstand the predatory cycles of nomadic invasion. Driven by this desperate need for cohesion, a Sufi order from Azerbaijan began to transform from a mystical brotherhood into a political juggernaut. The Safavids did not merely seek to rule, they sought to redefine the very essence of what it meant to be Iranian in a world dominated by the Sunni hegemony of the surrounding Ottoman and Mughal empires. The zeitgeist was one of apocalyptic longing, a belief that the world was broken and only a divinely sanctioned leader could mend the fractured pieces of the Persian soul. Inevitably, this reconfiguration of identity led to a collision of empires. In 1501, the young Ismail I entered Tabriz and declared Twelver Shi'ism the state religion, a decision that was both a geopolitical fortress and a spiritual proclamation. Consequently, a definitive theological boundary was etched across the Near East, transforming the Zagros Mountains from a porous frontier into a rigid ideological barrier. The Kizilbash, the Redheads, whose distinctive 12-pointed turbans signaled their fanatical devotion, became the shock troops of this new order. One can imagine a 19-year-old Kizilbash, his hair braided under his scarlet cap, looking out over the plains of Anatolia with the absolute certainty that his king was a living shadow of the hidden Imam. To him, the struggle was not over land, but over the very soul of Islam, a belief that provided the discipline necessary to withstand the weight of Ottoman logistics. Had the Safavids embraced the musket with the same fervor they reserved for their mystical devotion, the Battle of Chaldiran might have ended with Safavid standards flying over Istanbul, fundamentally altering the trajectory of Western Asia. The defeat at Chaldiran forced a necessary evolution. The zenith of this reconstruction arrived with Shah Abbas I, who understood that a nation requires a center of gravity. In 1598, he moved the capital to Isfahan, transforming a modest city into what contemporaries called half the world. The construction of the Naqsh-e-Jahan Square was a masterclass in urban theater, designed to integrate the mosque, the bazaar, and the palace into a singular expression of sovereign power. Forensic evidence of this ambition remains in the microscopic details of the Haftrangi tiles, the 7 colors technique that allowed for the intricate floral patterns and calligraphic inscriptions that adorn the Masjid-e-Shah. A master ceramicist would spend weeks perfecting the curve of a single indigo tile to catch the afternoon sun at the precise angle required to dazzle foreign dignitaries.
This was architecture as statecraft, a calculated display of permanence and wealth. As the 17th century progressed, this newfound cohesion placed Iran in the crosshairs of a changing global order. The arrival of the Shirley brothers, English adventurers who sought to modernize the Persian army, marked the beginning of a complex relationship with European powers. Early encounters with European mercantilism were characterized by a mutual fascination and deep-seated suspicion. The English East India Company, eager to bypass Ottoman-controlled silk routes, looked to the Persian Gulf as a theater of commerce. A ledger written at dawn in the port of Gambroon, later renamed Bandar Abbas, records the weight of raw silk exchanged for silver and English broadcloth, serving as a forensic marker of the moment the Iranian economy began to be tethered to the fluctuating demands of London and Amsterdam. This shift from the overland Silk Road to maritime trade routes signaled the slow erosion of the traditional nomadic power structures that had defined the region for millennia. The Iranian state, while architecturally and culturally at its peak, was beginning to struggle with the demands of a rapidly modernizing world that valued naval tonnage over the poetic traditions of the imperial court. Consequently, the success of the Safavid project, the creation of a distinct national identity, became the source of its future vulnerability. By isolating themselves from the Sunni world, the Safavids had created a fortress, but one that was increasingly besieged by the rising tides of colonial interest. The Great Game was not yet a formal conflict, but its roots were being planted in the soil of the Iranian Plateau as European diplomats began to map the passes of the Hindu Kush and the depths of the Persian Gulf. The state was forced to reconcile its ancient imperial traditions with a reality where power was increasingly defined by technological parity and global trade networks. A letter from a French traveler in the mid-1600s describes a court in Isfahan that was outwardly magnificent but inwardly anxious, sensing that the old certainties were slipping away. This tension between the glorious past and an uncertain future created a national psyche that was at once fiercely proud and deeply defensive, a trait that would define Iranian diplomacy for centuries to come. The legacy of this crucible is visible today in the geometry of the modern Iranian state. The Safavids took a shattered geography and forged it into a cohesive theological and political entity that survived even as the dynasty itself faded into history. The borders they defended and the religious identity they codified remain the primary catalysts for the regional dynamics of the modern world. The blue domes of the capital continue to reflect the sky, standing as silent witnesses to a time when a broken nation decided to invent itself anew, creating a boundary of the mind and spirit that no foreign invasion could truly erase. This was the birth of the modern nation-state in the Middle East, a process of painful crystallization that ensured the idea of Iran would remain an immutable fixture on the map of human civilization, forever shaped by the fires of its own reconstruction and the endless sovereign will of its people.
The Tehran sun of late 1905 did not merely illuminate the crumbling brick of the Qajar palaces. It exposed the structural rot of a monarchy that had bartered its sovereignty for the fleeting luxuries of European travel. The collective psyche of the Iranian merchant class and the clergy had reached a point of synchronized exhaustion, a rare alignment of the bazaar and the mosque born from the shared humiliation of Russian and British dominance. Driven by this encroachment, the movement for the Adalat Khaneh, or House of Justice, was not an imported democratic whim, but a desperate reclamation of Persian dignity. In January 1906, a small textile merchant named Hassan, his hands permanently stained with the indigo of his trade, stood among thousands in the sanctuary of a mosque, his breath visible in the morning chill, as he waited for a promise of law that would finally supersede the whim of a king. Hassan's quiet hope represented a broader shift. He was a man who had never read Montesquieu, but understood instinctively that the king's shadow was no longer enough to protect the shopkeeper from the tax collector. This individual longing for order transformed into a national demand, inevitably forcing the hand of a dying Muzaffar al-Din Shah. The signing of the first constitution was a moment of profound fragility. Had the Shah's heart failed an hour earlier, the royalists might have crushed the movement in the vacuum of succession. Instead, the ink on that document established a precedent for self-determination that would haunt every subsequent ruler of the century. By the mid-20th century, the landscape of the Iranian Plateau had been redrawn by the discovery of black gold beneath the Khuzestan sands, a resource that promised wealth but delivered a new form of vassalage. The psychological state of the 1950s was defined by a feverish nationalism, personified by the frail but iron-willed Mohammad Mossadegh. Consequently, the nationalization of the oil industry in 1951 was not merely an economic policy, but a psychological divorce from the colonial era. The air in Abadan was thick with the smell of crude and the electricity of defiance. However, history turned on the pivot of a few bags of American dollars and the orchestrated chaos of Operation Ajax in 1953. In the sweltering August heat of Tehran, where the asphalt of the main boulevards seemed to weep under the sun, a low-level clerk at the National Bank watched from a basement window as trucks filled with hired agitators roared toward the parliament. This low-level clerk, whose name is lost to history, spent the afternoon burning sensitive ledgers, sensing that the brief experiment in parliamentary sovereignty was being reduced to ash. Had the pro-Mossadegh forces acted with more decisive brutality in the early hours of that Tuesday, the Pahlavi monarchy might have remained a permanent exile. Instead, the restoration of the Shah by foreign intelligence agencies created an indelible scar on the national consciousness, a deep-seated suspicion of external interference that would eventually provide the ideological fuel for the 1979 upheaval. The Shah's subsequent white revolutions sought to modernize a civilization from the top down, yet it failed to account for the cultural gravity of the village and the pulpit, creating a society that was modern in appearance but spiritually adrift. The revolution of 1979 was the inevitable eruption of a pressure cooker that had been sealed for 25 years. It was a synthesis of the Marxist student, the traditional cleric, and the disenfranchised laborer, all united by the singular goal of ending Pahlavi autocracy. The spirit of the times was one of apocalyptic certainty. The streets of Tehran were not merely sites of protest, but theaters of a metaphysical struggle. In the cold February air, a young woman named Zoya, who had discarded her university textbooks to carry bandages for the wounded, felt the ground tremble under the weight of 1 million footsteps. She did not know that the secular democracy she envisioned would soon be eclipsed by a theopolitical structure that sought to merge the ancient concept of the Farah, the divine glory of kings, with the clerical authority of the Vilayet-e-Faqih. This transition was not a rejection of modernity, but an attempt to define a specifically Iranian modernity, one that looked to the 7th century as a blueprint for the 20th. The ensuing 8-year war with Iraq further solidified this identity, as the crucible of conflict fused the ancient Iranian cult of heroism with the immediate necessity of national survival. A 19-year-old conscript in the marshes of Fars, clutching a plastic key to heaven around his neck, became the modern incarnation of the warriors of the Shahnameh. He would never see the date harvest in his home village, but his sacrifice was woven into a new national mythos that prioritized resistance over comfort. Consequently, the Islamic Republic emerged from the 1980s not as a fragile experiment, but a battle-hardened state that viewed its existence through the lens of a 3,000-year-old struggle for autonomy. Throughout these political tremors, the bedrock of the Iranian story remained its intellectual and literary depth, a soft power that has historically proven more durable than any dynasty.
The same cultural machinery that had absorbed the Mongol hordes in the 13th century, turning fierce nomads into patrons of Persian art, continued to operate in the modern era. The verses of Rumi and Hafez remained the true constitution of the Iranian soul, recited by cab drivers and cabinet ministers alike. This linguistic and philosophical continuity allowed the nation to weather the isolation of the post-revolutionary decades. The elite in Tehran today do not view themselves as a pariah state, but as the rightful heirs to an ancient legacy that stretches back to Cyrus the Great. To understand the Iran of today is to recognize it not as a new actor on the world stage, but an ancient civilization that has mastered the art of endurance through adaptation. The 1906 Constitutional Revolution, the 1953 coup, and the 1979 revolution are not disconnected spasms of violence, but chapters in a single coherent narrative of a people seeking to reconcile their glorious past with an indifferent, globalized present. The resolution of this story is found in its continuity. The same cultural gravity that once tamed the steppe warriors now informs a modern regional power that views itself as the permanent fixture of the Middle East. A border drawn by a weary diplomat in a 19th century tent, or a decree signed by a shah in a moment of weakness, still dictates the geopolitical friction of the 21st century. Ultimately, the history of Iran is a horizon that never recedes, where the weight of 3,000 years informs every gesture of the present, ensuring that the nation remains an enigma to those who only see the surface, yet a source of profound strength to those who live within its deep historical currents.